The early months of 1940 were anticipated to be uneventful. After the so-called phony war period, where British and French troops remained behind the Maginot Line while Hitler consolidated his conquest of Poland, both sides seemed content to maintain a state of inaction. On April 4, 1940, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain informed the House of Commons that Hitler had missed his opportunity to attack earlier, a statement that was widely reported in the press and accepted by the public. However, this sense of calm was shattered just 3 days later, as Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. But this was merely the prelude to the real catastrophe that unfolded on May 10, 1940. At dawn on that day, German forces launched the massive Fall-Gelb offensive, deploying 141 divisions to crash into Belgium, the Netherlands. The world had never witnessed a conflict like this before. This was not the trench warfare of 1914, but rather the lightning-fast blitzkrieg. Stuka dive bombers screeched from the skies as panzer columns smashed through defensive lines that military experts had deemed impregnable. The Dutch army, considered well-trained and prepared, fell in just 5 days, while the Belgians held out for 18. What made this so terrifying was the sheer speed. In World War I, armies measured progress in yards per week, but in May 1940, German mechanized units were covering 50 miles per day. French and British commanders, still thinking in the mindset of the previous war, expected weeks to reposition forces and establish new defensive positions. The French military had constructed an extensive network of defensive fortifications along the German border, known as the Maginot Line. This engineering marvel, costing the equivalent of $3 billion in today's currency, featured underground railways, air-conditioned barracks, and retractable gun turrets. However, the line did not extend to the Belgian border, as the French High Command had erroneously believed the Ardennes forest to be impenetrable to tanks. By the time orders and intelligence reached the frontline units, the situation had already changed, rendering radio intercepts and reconnaissance reports obsolete. The French were unprepared for the German forces' swift advance through the Ardennes, leading to a catastrophic defeat in the early stages of the war. The Ardennes witnessed the resurgence of German panzer divisions, which crossed the Meuse River at Sedan, the same location where France had suffered defeat in 1870. This historical irony was not lost on observers. Within a week, the German forces had successfully wedged themselves between the British Expeditionary Force and the main French armies. The BEF, comprising nearly 400,000 British and French troops, found itself pushed towards the English Channel, with its back to the sea. In London, the War Office received reports that read like nightmarish accounts. Entire divisions had lost contact, supply lines had collapsed, and refugees clogged every road, hampering military movement. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the champagne was flowing. German intelligence reports projected that Britain would seek peace terms within 3 to 4 weeks of France's imminent collapse. After all, the British army was on the verge of annihilation in France, the Royal Navy could not halt the German tanks, and Britain lacked the industrial capacity and manpower to stand alone against the Wehrmacht. Surrender was not merely anticipated but deemed unavoidable by virtually every military analyst across Europe. Even some in London quietly concurred as Neville Chamberlain's government crumbled faster than France itself. On May 7 and 8, Parliament convened what became known as the Norway Debate, a scathing post-mortem of Britain's failed campaign to. Prominent Conservative MP Leo Amery invoked Oliver Cromwell's famous admonition to the Long Parliament, declaring that Chamberlain's government had sat too long and must depart. This impassioned intervention ignited the chamber, and when the vote was tallied, Chamberlain's majority crumbled from over 200 to a mere 81. Though he had technically prevailed, Chamberlain had irreparably lost the trust of Parliament and the nation. Undeterred, he attempted to form a coalition government with Labour and Liberal parties, but they steadfastly refused to serve under his leadership. 2 individuals emerged as potential successors to Chamberlain: Lord Halifax, the esteemed Foreign Secretary, and Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty. Halifax represented the establishment choice, an aristocratic, diplomatic figure respected within the Foreign Office. In contrast, Churchill was the unconventional candidate, renowned for his brilliance but also his erratic tendencies. A former liberal who had switched parties, Churchill had been blamed for the Gallipoli debacle in World War I and had spent the 1930s in political exile, warning about the threat of Hitler while others dismissed him as a warmonger. On May 9, Chamberlain convened a meeting with Halifax and Churchill to discuss the matter of his successor. According to Churchill's own account, a lengthy silence ensued after Chamberlain asked Halifax if he would accept the position. Halifax later recounted that the House of Lords' timing posed a significant challenge for leading a war government effectively, as historians have debated whether Halifax simply lacked the desire to shoulder the responsibility of guiding Britain through what appeared to be certain defeat. Sometimes, the most pivotal historical decisions involved choosing not to act. Consequently, the mantle fell upon Churchill. On May 10, 1940, the very day Germany launched its Western offensive, King George V requested that Churchill form a government. At 65 years old, Churchill later reflected on the sense of destiny and his entire past life's preparation for this momentous hour. The nation stood on the precipice of its gravest challenge, and the individual now entrusted with its deliverance had been dismissed as a political has-been mere months prior. Undaunted, Churchill swiftly assembled his war cabinet. Retaining Chamberlain as Lord President of the Council, he sought to maintain conservative unity and leverage Chamberlain's lingering influence among Tory MPs. Elevating Clement Attlee to the role of Labour leader and Lord Privy Seal, Churchill also brought in Halifax as Foreign Secretary. Crucially, he appointed Labour's Ernest Bevin as Minister of Labour, granting the trade unions direct representation in government. This was no mere political spectacle. Churchill recognized that Britain's survival hinged on achieving complete national cohesion. Class divides, partisan politics, and social stratification had become irrelevant. Yet, as Churchill formed his government on May 10 and 11, the news from France grew increasingly dire. The Dutch Queen had fled to London, and the Belgian army was in full retreat. French commanders sent increasingly desperate reports of one breakthrough after another. Looming in everyone's thoughts was the same daunting query: what would happen when France inevitably fell? It was becoming painfully evident that France's collapse was imminent. The only uncertainties were the timeline and Britain's subsequent course of action. As the panzers surged through France, a fierce debate raged within the British War Cabinet. From May 26 to May 28, 1940, the five-member body convened 9 meetings that would determine not just the nation's fate, but the entire trajectory of World War II. These were not abstract policy discussions, but rather grueling, exhausting arguments about national survival, dangerously close to tipping the other way. Lord Halifax had a plan. On May 25, with Italy still on the sidelines, he proposed that Britain approach Mussolini to mediate a peace settlement, as the Italian dictator waited to see which side would emerge victorious before committing his forces. The Earl of Halifax advocated for a pragmatic approach, suggesting a negotiated settlement with Germany rather than outright surrender. He reasoned that if Britain acknowledged Germany's continental dominance, perhaps Hitler would allow the British Empire to remain intact in exchange. Halifax argued this was not defeatism, but rather a realistic assessment of the dire situation. With France defeated and the British army cornered at Dunkirk, continuing the fight seemed futile. However, Churchill vehemently rejected this idea, understanding that any peace talks would place Britain in an extremely vulnerable position, with its military decimated and its French ally fallen. The Prime Minister recognized that there could be no compromise with Hitler, as any negotiations would begin from a position of profound weakness. The clock struck 8:07 as the demands for disarmament echoed through the halls. The British were urged to remain neutral while the consolidation of Europe's control intensified. Calls were made to reduce or hand over the Royal 814 Navy, and Churchill warned the War Cabinet on May 8, 27-26 that nations which went down fighting rose again, but those which surrendered tamely were finished. The debate raged on for hours, with Halifax persistently arguing that exploring peace terms did not equate to surrender. 842 Chamberlain, still recovering from the toll of cancer, wavered between the two positions, while Attlee and Arthur 847 Greenwood, the Labour representatives, quietly backed Churchill's stance, despite their junior status within the cabinet. The Tory-led cabinet convened in intense deliberations, with Churchill at one point departing the chamber. Halifax's diary later revealed his contemplation of resignation, a move that could have toppled the government and potentially prompted new negotiations. On May 28, Churchill took the unprecedented step of summoning the full cabinet of 25 ministers, not just the Inner War Council. In an impassioned address, he exhorted them to persevere, vowing that Britain would fight on, even if it meant going down in a blaze of defiance. Accounts indicate the ministers responded with enthusiastic cheers and table-pounding, a demonstration that, given the seasoned political nature of the gathering, Churchill later described as remarkable. The parliamentary representatives, to my surprise, reacted with enthusiasm. Several individuals abruptly rose from their seats and hurried towards my chair, shouting and offering congratulatory pats on the back. This marked a pivotal juncture. Halifax could no longer push for negotiations when the entire cabinet firmly backed Churchill's position. The debate had reached its conclusion, and Britain would persevere in the fight. Yet the true significance of these meetings lies in their secretive nature. The British public remained unaware of how perilously close their government had come to seeking terms with Hitler. Neither Parliament nor the Germans knew of these deliberations. Had Halifax prevailed, had Chamberlain aligned with him, had Churchill been outvoted, the entire trajectory of the war would have unfolded differently. Germany's fate hung in the balance. The fate of Europe hung in the balance as Nazi Germany threatened to seize control. Without a staging ground for the D-Day invasion, the Allied bombing campaign, or a second front, the Soviet Union would have faced the Nazi onslaught alone. Yet, it was not through military might, but rather Churchill's unwavering words and determination that turned the tide. He recognized that entertaining the enemy's terms for surrender would mean certain defeat. Survival sometimes demands the rejection of logical arguments for capitulation. Just 3 days after assuming the role of Prime Minister on May 13, 1940, a sleep-deprived Churchill addressed the House of Commons, delivering his first speech as Britain's leader. The reports from France were dire, as German forces continued their relentless advance. The nation was in disarray as the French forces crumbled. Churchill now had to convey to Parliament and the public the nature of the leadership they could anticipate. His speech, lasting a mere 6 minutes, was hastily composed between crisis meetings, yet contained some of the most impactful words ever uttered in the English language. Foregoing empty assurances, he bluntly declared, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." This was a stark departure from the typical political rhetoric of prosperity and progress. The nation faced a daunting road ahead, but Churchill's words conveyed unwavering resolve. He warned of a prolonged and arduous conflict, one that would demand immense sacrifice from the British people. Contrary to the prevailing military consensus, which predicted a swift German triumph, the Prime Minister outlined a steadfast commitment to wage war on all fronts, drawing upon divine strength to overcome the formidable challenges that lay ahead. His unequivocal policy declaration would become the guiding principle that would define Britain's wartime efforts in the trying months to come. The British leader's address conveyed a resolute determination to confront a heinous tyranny, unparalleled in the grim annals of human depravity. This was no mere territorial or economic struggle, but a moral crusade, a clash of civilizations. When asked about the nation's objective, the response was unequivocal. Victory, at any cost, through all adversity, however arduous the path. For without triumph, there could be no survival. This sobering reality underscored the gravity of the situation, as Churchill pledged not mere triumph, but the very chance to endure. The Prime Minister's address to Parliament struck a somber tone, acknowledging the precariousness of the nation's survival. Reactions were divided, with some MPs galvanized by his words, while others deemed his outlook overly pessimistic, even defeatist. The Times described the speech as befitting the grim circumstances. Yet Churchill's unwavering stance proved pivotal. He drew a clear line, rejecting any notion of negotiation or compromise. Britain would either emerge victorious or perish in the attempt. This uncompromising resolve provided a beacon of hope amidst the unfolding collapse. The speech transcended the walls of Parliament, broadcast by the BBC and printed in full by newspapers, reaching the people in London's underground stations, soon to serve as bomb shelters. Factories. The British public avidly consumed the Prime Minister's words during their midday respites. Meanwhile, troops bracing for the Dunkirk evacuation poured over the text. In Berlin, German intelligence officers grew increasingly unsettled, realizing they may have underestimated the resolve of their adversary. This was no surrender speech, but rather the defiant declaration of a leader prepared to sacrifice his nation rather than concede to Hitler's ambitions. Churchill grasped a fundamental truth about leadership that eluded his counterpart, Halifax, that people can endure immense hardship if they believe their cause is just. He did not offer mere optimism, but a sense of higher purpose. In the bleakest of circumstances, such purpose can prove more sustaining than hope alone. The German military intelligence, the AB, had meticulously studied British society and politics for years, painting a portrait of a nation plagued by class divisions, weary from the Great War, led by feeble politicians, and woefully unprepared for modern warfare. Their analyses unanimously pointed to the same outcome: Britain would crumble within weeks of France's defeat. However, this assessment proved to be catastrophically, historically inaccurate on almost every count. The German intelligence's conclusions were based on what appeared to be robust evidence. Throughout the 1930s, Britain had desperately sought to avoid war, with Chamberlain even traveling to Munich and conceding territory to Hitler. This seemed to confirm the perception of a weak, war-weary nation. Yet, the reality on the ground would shatter these assumptions. The British public initially welcomed Hitler's actions in Czechoslovakia, with large-scale peace rallies and even a resolution from the prestigious Oxford Union refusing to fight for the country. As Germany continued its expansionist policies, remilitarizing the Rhineland and annexing Austria, Britain remained largely passive, leading the Nazi leadership to believe that the British upper classes, including the aristocracy and business elite, would prioritize preserving their wealth and privileges over the prospect of war. This assessment appeared to be reinforced by the stance of Lord Halifax, an aristocratic figure who advocated for negotiations. German intelligence closely monitored the British class structure, convinced that the country's leadership would resist any call to arms. Many individuals maintained close social and economic connections with Germany during the 1930s. Some had even expressed admiration for the nation's economic achievements under Hitler's leadership. These people were reluctant to see their country embroiled in an unwinnable conflict. Hitler himself contributed to this misunderstanding, having studied the British Empire and convinced himself that the ruling class shared his pragmatic, power-driven mindset. In his view, once France fell, the British would recognize the futility of continued resistance and opt to preserve their empire through negotiation, rather than risk invasion. Hitler anticipated that British rationality would compel them to surrender. However, he failed to grasp that by. In the spring of 1940, Britain found itself in a precarious position, where rationality had become a luxury it could ill afford. The German intelligence agency, Abwehr, had also severely misjudged the character of Winston Churchill. Their files portrayed him as a has-been politician, a heavy drinker, and an impulsive romantic with a history of military failures. They noted his advanced age of 65 and assumed he lacked the stamina required for total war. Furthermore, they documented his years in political exile during the 1930s and concluded that he lacked widespread political backing. German analysts had studied his speeches from the previous decade, in which he had warned about the threat posed by Hitler, and dismissed him as a hysterical alarmist who had cried wolf too many times, rendering his warnings ineffective. They had focused on the evidence of Churchill's weaknesses and overlooked the signs of his true strengths. The landscape of Britain had undergone a profound transformation in the span of just 2 years. The policy of appeasement championed by Chamberlain had indeed bought valuable time for the nation's rearmament efforts. However, its true significance lay in the way it had educated the British public about the true nature of the threat posed by Hitler and the Nazis. Each broken promise, every act of aggression, and every deception had served to open the eyes of the people, even those who had desperately clung to the hope of peace. By the time the fateful year of 1940 arrived, the British public had come to the sobering realization that coexistence with the Nazis was no longer a viable option. The fall of France, which the Nazis had assumed would demoralize the British, had the opposite effect. It crystallized the understanding that as long as France continued to fight, Britain would not be alone in shouldering the burden of the conflict. The collapse of France left Britain with no middle ground. It was either fight alone or cease to exist as an independent state. This stark binary choice united the nation in a way that peacetime could never have achieved. The class divisions that German intelligence had counted on became irrelevant when the alternative was Nazi occupation. By May 26, 1940, the British Expeditionary Force found itself trapped. Over 400,000 Allied troops, British, French, and Belgian, were cornered against the coast at Dunkirk, with the English Channel at their backs. German panzer divisions had them surrounded on three sides, and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Every military expert who assessed the situation reached the same grim conclusion. The impending annihilation or capture of the entire force loomed large, a calamity that would eclipse any previous military disaster in British history. General Alan Brooke, commanding the Ski Corps, recorded in his diary a desperate plea. "Nothing but a miracle can save the BF." That miracle was soon to be codenamed Operation Dynamo. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, directing the evacuation efforts from Dover Castle, faced an insurmountable challenge: to extract as many troops as possible before the German forces closed in. The initial estimate was grimly modest, projecting the potential rescue of a mere 45,000 men over 2 days before the position became untenable. The Royal Navy had approximately 40 destroyers and various transport vessels at its disposal, but the mathematics were brutal. Even operating at peak efficiency, the available ships could not. The German offensive came to an unexpected halt on May 24, as Hitler ordered his panzer divisions to cease their advance on Dunkirk. Historians have debated the reasons behind this decision, with some suggesting that the Luftwaffe commander Göring had promised to destroy the trapped army from the air, while others believe the German generals wanted to conserve their tanks for the push into southern France. Some speculate that Hitler may have thought Britain would be more amenable to negotiations if its army was not completely decimated. Regardless of the rationale, the halt order granted the British a critical 48-hour window to establish a defensive perimeter around Dunkirk. However, even with this defensive line in place, the evacuation appeared daunting. Dunkirk's harbor had been heavily bombed, rendering large ships unable to dock and unload their cargo. The German forces relentlessly bombarded the troops stationed in the dunes, preventing them from reaching the shoreline. Facing this dire situation, Admiral Ramsay issued a desperate plea for any seaworthy vessel, no matter the size or purpose, to sail to Dunkirk and assist in the evacuation. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, private sailboats, and even river ferries answered the call. The Tomzine, a modest 14-ton fishing boat, managed to evacuate 7 soldiers, while the Sundowner, a private yacht, made multiple trips, rescuing 130 men. Over the course of 9 days, from May 26 to June 4, a fleet of 933 vessels, with approximately 700 being small boats, crossed the English Channel to ferry the troops from the beaches to the larger ships. The German Luftwaffe relentlessly bombarded the beaches throughout the night. The Royal Air Force flew over 3,500 sorties to provide air cover, but many soldiers on the shore believed they had been abandoned as the aerial battles raged inland. 6 British destroyers were sunk, and 19 more were damaged. At least 200 of the small boats used in the evacuation were destroyed or disabled. The waters were thick with oil from torpedoed vessels, making it difficult for soldiers covered in the slick substance to board the rescue ships. The final tally of the evacuation was staggering. A total of 338,226 Allied troops were successfully withdrawn, including 198,229 British and 139,197 French and Belgian soldiers. This far exceeded the initial estimate of 45,000 men over 2 days, as the operation was extended to 9 days and resulted in the rescue of over 300,000 personnel. In contrast, the Germans had captured or killed approximately 68,000 Allied soldiers. Allied soldiers captured 40,000 prisoners, but they had expected to seize the entire force. General Georg von Küchler, commanding the German 18th Army, expressed astonishment that so many had escaped. German military planners had counted on those 400,000 prisoners as proof of Britain's defeat. Yet, Dunkirk remained a military disaster for the British. They lost 68,000 troops killed, wounded, or captured, and left behind vast quantities of equipment: 2,472 artillery pieces, 20,000 motorcycles, 65,000 vehicles, and 76,000 tons of ammunition. The entire British Expeditionary Force's heavy equipment was gone, and 11 fighter squadrons had been lost. Britain's army had been driven from the continent. As Churchill told Parliament on June 4, the evacuation was a miracle of deliverance. The evacuation from Dunkirk was a remarkable feat, but it was not a true victory. As Germany had anticipated the complete annihilation of British forces, the survival of the troops was a miraculous accomplishment. The propaganda value of this event was immense, and the story of the small boats became legendary. Despite facing vastly superior enemy forces, the defensive perimeter had held firm. Crucially, Britain still had an army, though it would take years to re-equip and expand it. These men would fight again. On June 4, 1940, the same day the last troops were evacuated from Dunkirk, Winston Churchill addressed Parliament, delivering one of the most renowned speeches of his career. The Prime Minister had already delivered his impassioned call for unwavering commitment to the nation's cause just 3 weeks prior. But that was before the devastating collapse of France. Before the Dunkirk evacuation, before Britain found itself entirely alone in the fight. Now, he faced the daunting task of transforming a catastrophic military defeat into a rallying cry to persevere. Churchill began by meticulously outlining the events unfolding in France. No sugarcoating, no propaganda. He walked Parliament through the German breakthrough, the encirclement, and the desperate fighting retreat to the coast. He commended the Royal Air Force pilots who had flown themselves to the brink of exhaustion providing air cover. He acknowledged the French troops who had steadfastly held the perimeter, allowing the British troops were granted priority for evacuation. He conveyed the military situation truthfully, recognizing that misleading the people would not inspire them. They needed to grasp the severity of the circumstances before comprehending the importance of perseverance. He then addressed the unspoken thoughts. We must refrain from ascribing attributes of victory to this withdrawal. Wars are not won through evacuations. He resisted allowing people to perceive Dunkirk as anything other than a defeat. Yet, his brilliance manifested in reframing the meaning of that defeat. While Britain had lost the battle, it had not lost the war. The soldiers had been saved, and the fight would carry on. The confrontation itself represented a triumph over the presumption of capitulation. He outlined Britain's strategic predicament with uncompromising candor. The German forces would now pivot southward to 2438 vanquish France. When France fell, he emphasized when, not if, Britain would face invasion. He told 2445 Parliament, "We shall persevere to the last. We shall fight in France. We shall combat on the seas and oceans. We shall fight." 2451 with mounting self-assurance and mounting might in the air. Each statement built upon the previous one, broadening the domains where 2457 Britain would defy the enemy. Then came the climactic declaration, the words that would reverberate for the ensuing 80 years. We 2504 shall safeguard our island, no matter the price. We'll battle on the shores. We'll battle on the landing sites. We'll battle in the fields and on the streets. We'll battle in the hills. We'll never give up. Observe the escalation from shores to landing sites to fields to streets to hills. Churchill described a fighting retreat into Britain's interior. He vowed that even if Germany invaded, even if they seized the coasts, even if they reached London, the fight would go on until the last British soldier fell. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added the final line. And if, which I do not for a, in the face of potential subjugation and starvation of this island or a substantial portion thereof, our maritime empire, armed and safeguarded by the British naval forces, would persevere in the struggle until, in the Lord's appointed time, the New World, with all its power and might, emerges to rescue and liberate the old. This was no longer merely about Britain. It was about preserving any part of the free world until America could be persuaded to join the war effort. The speech resonated on multiple fronts. For the British populace, it was a rallying call that transmuted humiliation into resolute defiance. For the Parliament, it was a clear declaration of the government's. The German leadership was stunned by Churchill's unwavering stance. Contrary to their expectations, the British Prime Minister vowed to fight on relentlessly, street by street and house by house, until either Britain was destroyed or Germany was defeated. German intelligence had anticipated that the Dunkirk evacuation would shatter British morale, leading to the fall of Churchill and the pursuit of peace negotiations by Halifax. However, the opposite occurred. The evacuation had bolstered British determination, not diminished it. Despite Hitler's historic military triumph, his adversary refused to concede defeat. The French government capitulated on June 22, 1940, marking a symbolic reversal of fortunes. Hitler orchestrated the ceremony in the same railway carriage where Germany had signed the armistice concluding World War I, a deliberate gesture of retribution. With Western Europe now under German control, a string of swift victories had toppled Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France within a year. The Soviet Union's non-aggression pact with Germany and Italy's alignment with the Axis powers had further isolated Britain, which stood alone with no realistic path to triumph. Anticipating a peace offer in the coming days, Hitler believed he had conquered the continent, having forced the British Army's withdrawal from Europe. The Luftwaffe's numerical superiority over the Royal Air Force was undeniable. The Wehrmacht had already proven itself an unstoppable force. With France's defeat, it seemed clear that continuing the fight would only lead to national ruin. Recognizing this, Hitler prepared a peace proposal, offering to allow Britain to retain its empire and navy in exchange for acknowledging German dominance in Europe. He believed this to be a generous offer. However, the proposal never materialized. Instead, on July 14, 1940, the symbolic Bastille Day, Churchill ordered the Royal Navy to attack the French fleet at Mers el-Khabir in Algeria, to prevent it from falling into German hands. This decision resulted in the tragic loss of over 1,200 French sailors. It was a horrific choice, pitting yesterday's allies against one another. The British refusal to capitulate sent an unambiguous signal to both Hitler and Roosevelt. Britain was resolute in its determination to continue the fight, with no room for negotiation, compromise, or surrender. Realizing that Britain would not back down, as his intelligence services had wrongly predicted, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 16 on July 16, ordering preparations for the invasion of Britain. Operation Sea Lion would involve the deployment of German troops along the southern English coast. However, this invasion was contingent on Germany first achieving air superiority. The Royal Navy's overwhelming naval power precluded a direct challenge, but if the Luftwaffe could destroy the RAF, then German barges could cross the channel under air cover. The entire operation hinged on this critical prerequisite. The aerial conflict known as the Battle of Britain commenced in July 1940, reaching its apex over the subsequent 2 months. The Luftwaffe unleashed a relentless assault, targeting RAF airfields, radar installations, and aircraft manufacturing facilities. The struggle was unforgiving, with young British pilots flying 4 or even 5 sorties per day. Some squadrons endured catastrophic losses, with half their pilots killed or incapacitated within a week. Aircraft production struggled to keep pace with the mounting casualties. By early September, Fighter Command had suffered 466 pilots killed or rendered unfit for duty, and the training pipeline could not replenish their ranks quickly enough. The RAF teetered on the brink of collapse, and a few more weeks could have seen it cease to function as an effective fighting force. Then, a pivotal decision by Hitler would alter the course of the conflict. The Luftwaffe's pivotal decision on September 7 to shift their focus from assaulting RAF airfields to bombarding London proved a critical turning point. This strategic shift, partly retaliatory for a previous RAF raid on Berlin and partly an attempt to demoralize British civilians, inadvertently granted the much-needed respite fighter command desperately required. While the Blitz inflicted devastating civilian casualties, exceeding 40,000 lives lost, it ultimately saved the RAF. By month's end, it had become evident that the Luftwaffe had failed to secure air superiority, as RAF fighters continued to emerge undaunted, no matter their losses. British radar technology played a crucial role in this outcome. The German commanders found themselves unable to counter the advanced warning provided by the British radar systems, which gave them a critical 30 minutes and 42 seconds of advance notice. Tragically, German pilots who bailed out over England were captured as prisoners, while their British counterparts could return to the skies the very next day. On September 17, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion, though he never officially cancelled it, a clear acknowledgement that the invasion of Britain was no longer feasible. Churchill's rousing speeches had proven more impactful than even he had anticipated, as Germany had won every military engagement but lost the war of will. Britain had not defeated Germany outright, but had endured long enough to make the prospect of a German victory impossible. Ultimately, Hitler would shift his focus eastward, launching the invasion of the Soviet Union. 1941 marked a pivotal moment as Japan's assault on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into the ongoing global conflict. The alliance that would ultimately vanquish Germany was gradually taking shape. Yet, this alliance only materialized because Britain had resolutely refused to surrender, despite all rational calculations pointing to the inevitability of such a course. Those critical 3 weeks in May 1940, when Halifax advocated for negotiations and Churchill fought back, culminating in the War Cabinet's decision to persevere, proved instrumental in shaping the events that followed. Had Britain sought terms, the world would have been deprived of the heroic Battle of Britain, the Blitz survival saga, the inspiration for occupied Europe, the partnership with America, and the eventual D-Day invasion. Churchill possessed an insight that eluded the intelligence analysts and military experts. Sometimes, the refusal to concede defeat can be more consequential than any rational assessment. Enduring the immediate crisis often takes precedence over devising a comprehensive strategy for triumph. The paramount objective becomes simply persevering, with the path to eventual success deferred for later consideration. In certain instances, the mere act of outlasting adversity may constitute a satisfactory outcome.